Hi, Evelein.
Hi,
How are you?
good. A little bit nervous, but other than that, hanging in there.
You know your work better than anyone else.
That's true.
And hearing what you have to say. So this is just a great conversation. We're very pleased that you've joined us this afternoon.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. All right, I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, we're just about to get started, and Sam has already started the recording. Perfect. So we do ask if you would just say a couple of words about who you are and where you're coming to us from today, and then you can proceed into your presentation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So my name is Evelein, and I am a graduate student in cultural anthropology from Washington State University, although I am originally from the Netherlands. And my research as a cultural anthropologist centers around the human-horse relationship and the influence of culture on the lives of equines. And today I will be presenting part of my graduate research on human-horse relationships in American rodeo. And this part of my paper is called They Wouldn't Do It If They Didn't Love It, Theory of Mind as a Framework to Understand the Involvement of Horses in American Rodeo. Can I proceed?
Yes, please do.
Cool. So, rodeo has been an intrinsic part of the cultural environment of the Western United States for over a century. And what started out in the late 1900s as an informal pastime for cowboys quickly grew from a folk event to a national sport and into a multi-million-dollar industry in which countless humans and animals are involved. And the pivotal event in rodeo is called bronc or bucking horse riding, a category in which a contestant aims to ride a fiercely bucking horse for 8 seconds. Scoring is based on both the performance of the animal and the rider, and the more difficult the horse is to ride, the higher the total score will be. And from an outsider's perspective, rodeo's bronc riding events seem to contradict the types of interactions desired in most other equestrian cultures and contexts. These animals are not truly wild like feral mustangs, yet they are clearly not as tame as riding horses. And furthermore, the sole purpose of these creatures is to display behaviors that seem to contradict the previous 5 millennia of cultural intervention. And this makes bucking horse riding quite difficult to understand. And to the unfamiliar eye, it appears that all there is to this sport is an explosive battle between man and beast, resulting in the violent domination of one over the other. My challenge as a cultural anthropologist and as a Dutch person was to study this multi-species environment in order to gain an emic understanding of this unique and seemingly paradoxical human-animal relationship. And for those of you who are not familiar with rodeo or who have never been to a rodeo event, these are just some snapshots to give you an idea what bucking horse riding is all about. So on the top right, you see a bucking horse during a ride with a rider on its back and the fleece-lined bucking strap around its abdomen. And on the top left, you see a bucking horse after the ride being led out of the arena by an animal wrangler. On the bottom left, you see a couple bucking horses in their holding pen, kind of resting before the start of the rodeo. And on the bottom right, you see what that backstage rodeo area or like animal area might look like. Through an ethnographic study of bronc riding and its associated practices, 81 self-identified rodeo associates, including participants, stock providers, organizers, and fans from the Western United States were questioned about their relationship with bucking horses. And the aim of the study was to further the anthropological understanding of the symbiosis between culture and the human-animal relationship by focusing on human perceptions of animals in the cultural context of rodeo. And my work was guided by theoretical perspectives from cognitive and psychological anthropology, ethnobiology, and post-humanism. And one of the main objectives of the study was to analyze and theorize the emic views of cultural insiders, so the perspective of the people themselves regarding the nature and the behavior of bucking horses. And this objective was motivated by the polarized views between rodeo opponents and proponents. Although cultural outsiders often argue that rodeo promotes animal abuse and that these horses are provoked to buck through the use of cruel tools, rodeo associates argue that their livelihood depends on the well being of the animals and that abuse has no place in rodeo. However, there remains a huge gap between these two polarized perspectives, and the voice of cultural insiders remains underrepresented in both popular and academic literature concerning ethics, welfare, and rodeo animals. So these are my methods of data collection. I conducted ethnographic fieldwork in the Northwest United States in 2019 and 20. And I visited 6 multi-day rodeo events where I gathered qualitative data through systematic participation and observation. I further conducted 6 1 to 2 hour semi-structured interviews with key informants. This method relies on an interview guide to ask comparable, standardized, but open-ended questions. And then when the COVID outbreak obstructed my in-person fieldwork, I created an online self-administered survey that contained a combination of open-ended questions and free lists to reach a wide audience and to obtain a systematic bulk data set. And this slide might be a little bit intimidating, but this is just a breakdown of my data analysis method. So the data analysis of my research relied on a grounded theory approach. And this is a method that is based on inductive bottom-up reasoning. I coded every word or sentence in my transcripts that had relevance to my research questions, and I grouped these codes into categories of resemblance. Based on the relationship between these categories, certain narratives emerged about the human-bronc relationships. These narratives were then linked into substantial categories in order to understand the social phenomena. They were linked into substantial theories in order to understand the social phenomena. And the last 2 aspects of this analysis, so selection of these narratives and the theories that emerged from them, they form the core of my presentation today. So before I really dive into the results of the study, I want to share some quick demographics about my informants. So about half of the informants were affiliated with professional rodeo, and the other half were involved in various non-pro circuits. Rodeo, ranching, or other agricultural activities, including involvement with animals, are often central tenets in the lives of my informants. And many people proclaim to come from a ranching, horse-related, or otherwise Western background. So I approached bucking horses as a cultural domain because my informants perceived broncs as a distinct category of animals, separate from other groups of rodeo animals, even separate from other groups of rodeo horses. And I wanted to understand how rodeo associates think about and understand these animals and think about and understand their nature and their points of view as well, but also their distinct behavior. So, in the minds of rodeo associates, what constitutes a bucking horse? How do they describe these animals based on how they categorize them in their mind? And this is best explained in the form of kind of like a metaphorical funnel, I guess. So, to start off, bucking horses are domesticated animals. They are not perceived as wild animals, neither in behavioral terms nor in terms of their natural state. Even though broncs are often marketed as wild, they cannot be compared to wild mustangs, for example, or to feral horses who have never been subjected to human handling and training. Second, bucking horses are produced through breeding programs, and they are purposefully and systematically bred. Their sires and dams are proven bucking horses who live in large herds for most of the year and who grow up and live naturally without much interference of humans. Furthermore, bucking horses are gentle, but they are not gentled. This means that their disposition is like any other horse. They aren't inherently mean animals who despise humans, but they also aren't overly desensitized to human handling and human contact. So, for example, the average bucking horse has to be placed in a holding chute for grooming and doctoring purposes because they aren't accustomed to standing tight. But at the same time, they are accustomed to these practices and they do not experience fear when they undergo grooming and doctoring, for example. And then lastly, bucking horses undergo conditioning to understand what is expected of them. At the age of 3, more or less, they are occasionally taken to training facilities where they are conditioned to understand the connection between the bucking strap and the weight on their back and the release of this pressure once they start bucking. They are not released into the rodeo arena without any prior practice, and they are prepared carefully so that they are accustomed to this process and to their surroundings at the rodeo. So, how do rodeo associates interpret and explain the behavior of these animals? So, first off, bucking horses are believed to possess what they call a bucking trait, which is a heritable trait. And this trait is seen as a predisposed response to any weight on their backs. And this trait can also be passed down to future generations of horses. And a horse that doesn't possess this trait, such as a wild Mustang, for example, or a spoiled quarter horse with a bad attitude, will not show the desired response to the stimulus of the rider and the bucking strap. And second, like I mentioned before, bucking horses get conditioned to understand what is expected of them. Um, and also in order to understand that these horses demonstrate the desired response to certain stimuli. And like I said, they get, conditioned to handling, certain degrees of handling, to grooming, doctoring, and to the different stimuli at the rodeo event. So rodeo associates want to make sure that these animals do not experience fear or confusion at the rodeo, because this could be very dangerous for the humans and animals involved. And third, although rodeo associates explained that the bucking strap, so that fleece lined strap that we saw in the picture, the strap is not the main motivator for the behavior. The strap is used to standardize and structure the movements of the animal and to make sure that they kick upwards and outwards instead of running forward and covering too much ground. And then lastly, but also most importantly, bucking horses buck because they possess the right attitude or character or drive for this behavior. And just possessing that bucking trait is not sufficient because a bronc needs to possess the inherent innate desire to buck. And a horse from proven bloodlines that does not possess this attitude will not buck, and also cannot be forced to buck through the use of tools, for example. So the agency of the animal in regard to their response to stimuli defines whether or not they are considered to be a true bucking horse. So in this paper, I argue that rodeo associates' perceptions on the nature and behavior of their animals can be explained through the concept of theory of mind. And theory of mind is a theoretical concept that originated in the field of psychology, and that is also often used in anthropological psychology, or psychological anthropology, I should say. And this theory refers to the empathic abilities of humans. So briefly explained, it refers to the idea that we as humans have the capacity to attribute mental states to other humans. And it also refers to the idea that we can infer intention and knowledge from the behavior of other humans, in the sense that we can make assumptions about what is going on in the minds of others, what people are thinking, and what their intentions and goals are. And this theory is usually applied in the context of human psychology, for example, to explain the developmental state of a child. Um, Although some researchers are also trying to figure out if animals have that capacity for a theory of mind. So the question is then, what models of mental states do rodeo associates formulate about their horses? And those are listed in this circle right here. So for example, rodeo associates think that bucking horses want to buck and that they like to buck because they are genetically and naturally predisposed for this behavior, kind of the same way that a racehorse is bred to run. And bucking horses are also perceived to have agency in their actions because not all purposefully bred bucking horses will result to bucking. And some horses will stop bucking at certain points in their lives, or they will only buck under certain circumstances. And furthermore, bucking is seen as a natural inherent behavior for any horse, and even a tame saddle horse will buck in certain situations. And for a variety of reasons, bucking horses are also believed to understand what is expected of them. They are perceived to demonstrate behavioral changes when they read certain cues in their environment or certain cues in the behaviors of people. So, for example, sometimes like in rodeo, there's this joke that goes something like, "This horse has been to so many rodeos it can sing the national anthem," for example. And this one time I was backstage at a rodeo, and a stock contractor, so an animal provider, was showing me his bucking horses, and then the national anthem started playing. And he explained to me, like, observe the horses. You can see their ears go forward and their heads go up when that national anthem starts. So they know that the rodeo is about to start and they know that the events are about to happen. So in terms of these, what was I talking about? So in terms of that, people think that rodeo horses, understand what is happening around them. This is also for them supported by the fact that, some horses will, or like horses will only buck once they are released from the bucking chute. They won't buck in the holding pens or they won't buck in the bucking chute. And then once they are done with their job or performance, they return to this calm state of mind, just like the horses you see in this picture, as soon as they are back in their holding pen and as soon as the ride is completed. And in addition, broncs are perceived to enjoy the process of dislodging the rider off their backs. And they're also believed to be aware of their jobs and the idea of competition with humans. And people explain to me, for example, that some horses put in more effort to dislodge certain riders, or they can also be seen strutting victoriously through the arena at the end of a ride, for example. So what are the implications of this study? What can we learn from this approach? And what are the various implications of this for us as scholars, but also for the humans and animals involved in rodeo, and for the ongoing debate between those who oppose and propose the rodeo? And like I mentioned before, emic perceptions were lacking in both the popular and academic discourse. And as an anthropologist, I value a culturally relativistic stance in the sense that I aim to understand the culture on its own terms and try not to make judgments using the standards of my own culture. And because of this, I have the responsibility to kind of serve as a cultural broker between various parties and their interests, and those people that have different perspectives about this subject. And what we've seen in the field of medical anthropology, for example, such as in the past Ebola outbreaks, is that people's own understanding, people's folk understanding of a disease is often very different from biomedical views. And in situations like this, taking a relativistic perspective and approaching a community in a culturally sensitive way is a lot more effective in achieving sustainable solutions. And furthermore, engaging with sensitive communities, such as the rodeo community, and putting in an effort to understand their emic perspective on things opens up the possibility to propose and conduct more effective research. So with my research, for example, now that we have found a way to work with the rodeo community and hopefully, have created this accurate representation of their point of view, we could also objectively measure their supposed models of mental states of these animals. So, for example, if rodeo associates argue that the animals buck because they like it and that they not experience stress and fear, we could offer different parameters to test this, like non-invasive methods such as like heart rate or cortisol stress levels. And being culturally sensitive in my engagement with this community has also led to an establishment of trust and rapport, which leads to further possibilities for future research. So that is all that I had prepared for you guys today. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.
Well, thank you very much, Evelein. That was very interesting. Perhaps you could take your slide down for the discussion or the question period. There we go. Thank you. And would anyone like to ask? Oh, Sam, you've got a question.
Can I go?
Of course.
But thank you for that. I enjoyed it very much. I appreciate your willingness to do field work as an anthropologist, as someone who does philosophy. I'm greatly intimidated by that. So good on you for doing that. You mentioned some doubt about theory of mind and other creatures. You may be familiar, Franz de Waal has done some really interesting work on that, particularly with chimpanzees, where he more or less proved theory of mind by devising clever experiments where their hierarchy would be disrupted in sight or out of sight. So for example, if the top ranking chimp gets food first, so they obscured that chimp's line of sight, and the second ranking chimp at that time was willing to go out of order and take food. But if he knew that the top ranking chimp had a clear line of sight, they would not go out of order. So it's quite almost comical the way in which they show that these chimps are thinking like, oh, I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder what they're thinking. I mean, it's not concrete proof, of course, but it's pretty darn close. So that's just a comment. But I wanted to ask, you said as an anthropologist and a relativist, you try to accept cultures at face value, but certainly there must be limits, right? I mean, if the culture is just profoundly abusive, which is not the types that well, depends on what you mean by profound, but suppose the circumstances were much worse. At some point, I think you would cross from, I'm not here to judge your practice, to this is inappropriate. Is that fair to say? Or I wonder how you think about that.
It is fair to say, but you also, I think it was Connor who mentioned that yesterday, you want to keep your professional side separated from your personal side. If I was researching Tennessee walking horse, training practices in the southern United States, I would probably feel really differently about, my subject of study, because I am very opposed to a lot of their practices. But rodeo is a very complex and varied type of events, and the different animals in rodeo lead different lives and they're treated differently. So I just try to keep that personal distance from that, and not to get too much involved with the things that I don't like, because my personal opinion isn't gonna change anything. Yes, I don't know if that kind of answers your question. I just keep that distance personally, and then try not to judge, even if there's things that I don't agree with. But it helps that I don't consider rodeo in the same line, or at least bucking horse riding, the same as Tennessee walking horse training, for example, to name something, or SeaWorld, for example.
Thank you, Evelein. Any other questions? Jan.
I think my question is quite similar to Sam's. The connection between anthropology and ethics. I get quite uncomfortable by seeing some of this behavior and some of these justifications. I'm very familiar with cows coming out of the stable at the end of winter and going into the field, and they start showing the behavior that your rodeo people seem to be reporting about the horses going from a small field into a big field and starting to jump about and buck, etc. But to interpret that behavior as similar to what they do when they've got a rider on their backs seems a bit extravagant. So the fact that you suggest that you have to leave certain personal feelings aside, to me suggests that there's something that you find very uncomfortable about doing that, because otherwise it wouldn't be so problematic, I think. So is it not possible to be an anthropologist and to take a genuine interest in what these people have to tell you themselves, and to try and sort of report their behaviors in the way that they see them, and at the same time keep having your ethical focus as a human being, because we are ethical beings? And after you've done your analysis, try to present their views, then you can come up with your critique of what you really think about their justifications, whether they are just trying to justify a practice that really is not quite acceptable, which human beings are quite good at, or whether their justifications really do hold water, and which is why I think you talk about these other methods. We could try and examine their cortisol levels, etc., because ultimately we do want to be knowing what really goes on, which is what the ethical justification is going to be based on, rather than on people's stories about what they think it is acceptable in their view from their particular perspectives. I'm not sure if I expressed this very well, and I talk too long anyway.
Well,
Those are a lot of questions in one, but I'll try to answer.
Yeah. What do you think, Evelein?
So I think that my personal view on rodeo should absolutely not be included in my research, because that would cloud the objectivity of the anthropological analysis. And this is not a study of how does Evelein feel about research. This is a study of representing how people think, how cultural insiders think about their sport and their animals, and how they justify what they think is happening and all that.
Yes,
I forgot what else you asked.
But Evelein, how can you not be clouded in your reporting of their behaviors? If you really were interested in them telling their story, what's the point of having you as a researcher going in? They can just publish their own stories in their rodeo magazines. No?
But they're not going to, well, I mean, they can, but if they publish their own material, they leave out that factor of anthropological analysis, and they leave out that comparability, for example, between their opinions and or like their emic point of view and other horse people's point of view, for example. There is no analysis in what they would say. And these are also subjects that they don't often consciously think about. They have their specific discourse, I guess, when it comes to their animals, but they're not sitting there and thinking, I wonder if this horse has agency, for example. Those are all anthropological concepts that we apply to a certain situation. But if we don't do that, if we don't take a step back and look at the situation anthropologically, then you're never going to be able to compare that situation. No, that's not a good explanation of what I want to say. If you don't take a step back and look at it like an anthropologist, then you'll never be able to include that rodeo discourse into the scientific field of anthropology, of human-animal relation studies, and perhaps also ethics, for example.
Yeah. I can see what you mean, Evelein. Anyhow, I think I'll be interested in what you think about the method that I used in chapter 3 of my book, I think, Animal Deliberation, which is slightly different. I kind of go in as an anthropologist on the one hand, but then the ethical layer, as Sam calls it, is put on top at the end of the sort of attempt to do some anthropological studying.
This looks a lot to me like both the beauty and the difficulty of interdisciplinary work is, it gets at the nuance, but it also makes things really complicated. I don't mean to speak too long. Rebecca, I know you have a question. We have just 1 minute.
No, yeah, just to withdraw my question, but it was just a side comment now, which is that, this is one of the things that animal ethicists often have trouble with, isn't it? The sort of objectivity that some people strive for with regards to their research. I think this is a kind of big part of what really is actually happening. But anyway, I'm not going to. Time is up.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Evelein, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your contribution and the attendees as well. We have another session here starting at this very moment. So thank you again, and we will jump
See you in the
sessions
next
now.
session.